Hello, this is Dr. Denise Zeynep Leuenberger, and I'm here to talk to you about strategic planning basics. This set of slides does an overview of all of the strategic planning processes here at Bridgewater State University. Our strategic planning process is unique in that it achieves two different sets of goals in the planning process. One of those is a level of inclusion. In our model, we're using a nested design to make sure that divisional, college, departmental, and program level plans are addressed. Additionally, our plan is an ongoing process. What we're planning to do is to review the process annually and use a 10-year vision cycle to make sure that we're always in line with all our resources and changes in our environment. As I mentioned before, we're using a model that uses inclusion, and in that model, the strategic planning process looks at three different segments. One of those is institutional strategy. Institutional strategy really looks at work done at the organizational level, so at the university level. And there are two portions to that. The first one really outlines the goals and objectives for the organization, and then the second one is the implementation plan, which outlines how we're going to get there using the resources that we have. Additionally, we have operational plans, and those are divisional, college, and departmental level plans. And then finally, we have tactical integration. Tactical integration is where the policies and procedures are eventually going to line up with the strategic planning process. The nested design looks at the work at three different levels. So we have the BSU institutional level strategic plan, or the macro level plan. That will be completed by June of 2017. The remainder of the plans will be completed throughout 2017 and 2018, and then we will be on a 3-year review cycle. It's also important to note that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Board of Higher Education has mandated some outcomes for us in the strategic planning process. First of all, they've asked us to review 6 different guiding principles in the plan, and those are workforce alignment, preparing citizens, closing achievement gaps, student learning, college completion, and college participation. In other slides, you'll see more discussion on each of these, but all of these will be integrated into our strategic planning process, and we will be doing outcomes measures on our dashboards tied to each of these vision project goals. So let's switch a little bit from the overview to what your strategic planning process should look like. The big piece that we have to look at is future orientation. As I mentioned before, we're using a 10-year vision horizon. And so what that means is that we're looking out to 2027 in our planning process. The reason that that's really important is that some projects really can't be completed in a short period of time, so the 3-year cycle. So what we might have to do is in the first 3 years maybe plan the resource development for it. In the next 3 years we might decide to plan the actual structural changes that need to happen, and then we may actually implement the change in the next 3 years. A great example of this is when we're working on a very large building project. It's going to take 10 years to complete that. But if we don't start doing parts of that work in the first year, we're never going to be ready in 10 years to be able to implement that process. Again, the 10-year horizon is really important, but it's important to understand that that 10-year horizon has been divided up into 3-year cycles along the way. Your plan should also be opportunity seeking, and we're going to talk a little bit in future slideshows about SWOT analysis, but what that means is that you want to look at the environment in which you're working and really take advantage of the strengths and weaknesses in the internal part of the organization and really review the opportunities and threats in the environment to make sure that you're taking advantage of those as you move forward with planning. Another component to think about is engaging stakeholders, and we have a set of slides that you'll review tied to stakeholder inclusion. Vision of strategic planning. It can't be strategic planning without stakeholders having full involvement. Finally, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to short-run and long-run planning. Short-run planning is tied to that 3-year cycle, which means that there are some things that we need to really address immediately and need to complete in that amount of time. And also the long run, meaning that we really need to pay attention to long-term goals for which we may not see completion in the 3-year cycle. I would like to talk a little bit about the steps of the strategic planning process. A traditional model here that's displayed indicates 11 different steps, and I'll go through each of these separately. The first one is the initiation of the strategic planning process. It's important that someone on your team really champion the process and that someone on your team also manages the process. And tied to that initiation, you want to make sure that you're using data effectively as you move forward. And that includes making sure that you're looking at internal and external assessments. And again, as we mentioned before, looking at stakeholders. You want to pay attention to data-driven decision-making using macro-level outcomes that might be available through our IR office. Another component to pay attention to is your vision statement. The vision and the mission statements guide our strategic planning process. The vision allows us to move forward by really identifying a narrative that looks to the longer term. The most important thing about the vision statement is that it should really be tied to the identity of the institution or the unit that you're working in, but also it should be something that may not be completely achievable. It should be sort of ambitious in the way that it's defined. In our plan, as we mentioned before, our vision horizon is the year 2027. We also want to pay attention to mandates as we move forward with strategic planning. The mandates that we're especially paying attention to are budget, legal, accreditation, and political. Each of these will be discussed further in other slides, but what we really mean by mandates are these are the baseline limitations or barriers that your unit is facing that you need to address before moving forward. And the first step, of course, is to identify what those mandates might be. Sometimes that baseline can be used as an opportunity, and sometimes it is a limitation that you have to make sure you have planned enough resources to cover. For instance, with accreditation, it's obviously an opportunity for our organization to excel through the accreditation process, but it also means that we need to set aside additional resources to measure outcomes tied to accreditation, to do reporting. Again, we need to make sure we're planned for that in the strategic plan. Vision and values are also an important component of the process. What we really want to think about with the mission statement is that it's the touchstone of your plan. When you're designing your mission statement, you'll be able to use some guidelines and some workbooks that we've created for you to help you establish a mission statement that really identifies the characteristics of your organizational unit that you'd like to highlight. As I mentioned before, stakeholders are central to strategic planning. And one of the things that you may want to think about at the very beginning of your process is how you're going to include stakeholders, knowing what the resource limitations you have in terms of time and money are. So in our case, one of the things to think about is using data sources that we may have already created for you at the institution. You'll be able to see in future slides some information about the listening tours outcomes and other surveys and instruments used through the IR department that might help you fill some of the gaps you might have in your collection process. It's also acceptable and actually encouraged for you to create some instruments of your own. A lot of units that may have their own accreditation type assessments may be able to use those as well. And so, of course, that leads us to assessment. And one of the things that we'll talk about a lot more later on is the SWOT analysis piece. But you should also be looking at assessment in terms of your outcomes. And so when we do our work here at BSU, we'll be looking at inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Inputs are the resources that we're going to invest in the planning process. The outputs are the measurable quantitative units that we can actually count in terms of what we've achieved. And outcomes are really a little more hard to measure. They're usually a little bit more subjective. And those are the things that we know that we've made a difference through. And so when you're doing some type of impact, one of the things that we want to look at is how much resources did we really spend on this process? The output, which says, all right, did we hire enough individuals to do the work? Did we create enough space in which to do the work? And then finally, we need to also assess, did we achieve the goals that we've established for ourselves? And so that might be something like student success. And what's important here in the assessment piece is that in order to be able to move forward with assessment of a goal, we have to be able to establish goals, objectives, and tasks to be able to measure. That moves us to goals, objectives, and tasks. Again, there are some workbooks within the Blackboard site that you can use to write your goals and objectives. It'll also do some definition of those terms. Again, these need to be very clear, but they also need to be ambitious, but yet achievable at the same time. So there's a lot of balancing as we design these. A big question that comes up often is what's the difference between goals and objectives and tasks? And the best way I can identify those for you is that they subordinate into each other. And so they may actually read very similarly, but as you're going down the subordination list, you're adding more and more detail to the process. By the time you get to the tasks, you should almost have a checklist of things that you want to complete. And when you've sort of checked off each of those tasks, you will have completed the objectives. That list of objectives, as they're completed, will lead to the completion of the goal. When we get to the task and objective levels, you have important pieces to add in, such as where are your resources coming from and how much resources do you have? who's responsible for the work that's being done, and what's your timeline. And so as you can see, the goals are a little bit more general, and as you move down that line, you get more and more specific so that you can achieve those goals in the long run. Another important thing I want to highlight here is that there should be no goals in your plan that aren't somehow related to the mission, the vision, the entire identity of the organization, and that you've also considered your mandates. So we have to make sure that everything we're trying to achieve fall within the baseline created by those mandates. As we're looking at the strategic planning format, you'll also see two workbooks that are tied to how you should format the way you're creating your strategic plan. One is a strategic plan summary, and the other one is a more detailed version of that. In order for you to format your strategic plan, we've created a couple of templates for you to use on the Blackboard site. The first one allows you to list the goals that you have for your organizational unit, which will be then tied into the strategic plan of the level above your unit. And the second one adds a lot more detail to that, adding the timelines and the responsible parties as well as resources. In strategic planning, we really want to start moving towards aligning resources in terms of money and people into the plan. As you know, at BSU, we haven't always had, for instance, replacement costs for larger scale equipment or funding for larger scale programs that we might be really invested in. And so what might happen is that the funding for those resources comes when some type of emergency happens, like the piece of equipment breaks, or a mandate comes down from some source that says we have to move forward with it. What we want to do is have an incremental plan for those processes. And actually, we have an example on campus that's very much tied to that. We have a computer replacement policy, for instance, that replaces computers on a periodic basis. And what that allows us to do is to rotate resources around so that at no time will we have to replace all of that equipment at the same time. And so as you're thinking about your resources and people, think about what you actually need to achieve the goals and tasks that you're hoping to achieve. The final step, of course, is implementation. In order for us to be successful, we really have to use the plan. We need to refer back to it regularly. We're also going to take some time to create some additional workbooks for you that will allow you to check back in with your division leaders to let them know how you're proceeding along with your goals. Every level of the planning process will be reviewed at least annually, and then a more major level of review will occur every 3 years. And we will move forward with that review process immediately after the first level of planning has occurred at the institutional level. Of course, we also want to make sure that we reassess and document the process. So we want to reevaluate the program regularly and make changes as needed. But we will also have quarterly reports, annual reports, and dashboards to help you see progress on your strategic planning documents. Thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to working with you on the strategic planning process.